Okay, so now I'm going to explain the code. Um, so we starting with the config folder. So here we have our first class, which is a security config. So here we have an annotation configuration, which will just mark the class as a Spring Security configuration. Next, we have a bean. So public password encoder and return new password encoder. So this is just used to hash the password before saving them to the database. Next, we have the CSRF configurer, CSRF disable, which will disable the CSRF for protection. Next, we have authorize HTTP request, auth any request, permit all. So this will just allow all requests without any authentication. Here we have the form login disable. This will just disable the default login form. And then here we have HTTP basic dot disable, which will disable the HTTP basic authentication. And then we have the return HTTP build, which will just build and return the security configuration. So over here, this is the Swagger config. Okay. So another annotation for configuration, which we just mark class is a Spring configuration class. And then here we have public open API, event open API. This will just create and configure the open API in the Swagger documentation. Here we have information, new info. So here we have the title, which will be the API title shown in Swagger UI. Here we have a description, which would just be a short description of the API. Then we have the version, which is the API version, and then obviously in external docs, new external documentation, which just links the external documentation to it. And then here we have the description and a URL to GitHub, basically. Okay, so I just see. Yeah, I am done with the configuration folder. So moving on, I'm going to the controller. Just close all these. So this is the AI controller. So here we have an annotation for risk controller, which will just mark the class as a risk controller, annotation for request mapping, which is the base URL for AI endpoints, and then the annotation cross origin, which will just connect the front end to the back end to the front end. And then over here we have private final event servers. So this is the service to fetch all the events. And then here we have public AI controller, this dot event servers equals to event servers, which is just a constructor injection. Next we have a annotation for post mapping response. So this is just the endpoint for the chatbot message. Here we have string message rule payload. Get or default, so message default value to lowercase, this will just give the raw message that the user sent. And then over here we have string is a message, raw message, replace all with regex, and dot trim, so this will just clean the message out that the user sent. Here we just have logs for debugging purposes. And then over here we have map string object response, new hash map, which will just map the response. And then here, this is where we handle the greeting. So here it says if the user message is empty, or the user message equals to hi, or the user message equals to hello, or the user message equals to hey. That response dot put should be that response put type is a greeting, and the AI should reply by saying hello, what type of events are you looking for, and it should list all the categories of there. And then it will return a response with a 200 OK. Over here, we have string category, detect category is a message, so this will just detect what kind of category the user is looking for. So this is how to handle an unknown category. So if a category equals to null, the response type should be, sorry, I didn't understand it. Try one of these categories and it should return a 200 OK response. Then over here, it says list event DTL events at service, get all events, which is fetch all the events. And then here, we have list string keywords, category keywords. So those will just get all the keywords. And then list event detail filtered, which will just filter all the events. And then we have filter match any keyword. So this will just match any keyword that the user put in. And then we have the sorted, which will just sort the message comparing it to the date, if it is null or if it's in a natural order, and it will just add it to the list. And if there are no events, or if the events are empty, it will just respond with I couldn't find any of the categories events in Johannesburg right now, and it will return a response of a 200 OK. Then over here, just highlight that. Over here we have list event TTL hot filter.stream number max size 3 collectors collector list. So here it's going to pick 3 hot picks from the events list. And then also over here it is list event more filter.stream skip and 3 collectors to list. So this will just add the remaining events to the list. And then here we have list mapping string a message array list. This is just a message for the front end. Just okay. Let's see, I have the same thing. Let me just remove this. So yeah, moving on, we have check if the hot list is not empty. So if the hot list is not empty, it's going. Sorry, before I go on, you have AI message add map of sender, AI text hot plus capitalized category and pics. So this is just going to add a header message to indicate the hot pics for the given category. Next, it's going to loop through each event in the hot list, and then it's going to retrieve the current event object with the event DTO equal to hotter get. Next, it's going to build and add a message for this event over here, and then it's going to format the message like one event title and then the date and the description, and then it's going to append the date if it's available over here by event get date, and if it's null, or event get date, and it will just list if it's available. And then over here it's just going to append the description if the event is available. If there is a follow-up question, this is how the AI should respond. So it will respond by saying what's the vibe, chill, party, outdoor, foodie, or another type of category. And then the response type should be an event. Then it will return the category, and then it will return the structured message, and it should return a 200 OK response. Here we have Boolean matches any keyword event DTO event list string keywords. So this is just going to check for any keywords. So if the string text event get title, this will just get a title for a specific event as well as a description, and it should turn it to lowercase, and it will return any match that the user was looking for. And then over here we can just see that this is all the categories available that the AI can use to match with some keywords over there. So like for tech, it's going to look for tech, technology, AI, fintech, startup, cyber, cloud, digital, Music is going to look for music, DJ, concert, festival, live. Cooking is going to look for cook, cooking, food, chef, kitchen. And Christmas is going to look for Christmas, well, another Christmas spelled differently, festive, and holiday. Next, we have private string detect category string message. This is just going to detect the category from the message. So if the message contains Christmas or that kind of Christmas, it should return Christmas. Or if it contains tech or technology or AI or startup, fintech, it should return tech. If it contains music, DJ, concert, festival, music, it should it should return music. And if it also contains cook, food, cooking, chef, it should return cooking. Or if it doesn't match any of those, it should return a null response. And lastly, we have private string capitalize. So this is going to capitalize the first letter. So if str equals null or str is empty, return str. For the substring, is in 1 to uppercase, and the substring should be 1. So this will just capitalize the first letter. That is it for my AI controller. Moving on to the auth controller. So here we have the annotation trace controller. This marks the class as a trace controller. Annotation request mapping, which is the base URL for the auth endpoints, and then the annotation cross origin, which allows any request from the front end basically. So here we have the private user repository. So this is just going to access the user data from the database. Private user repository. Oh, I repeated that. Private password encoder. Password encoder. This will just hash and verify the passwords. And then over here, the private JWT util, which will generate a JWT token. And then post mapping register. This will just register a new user. And then over here we have if user repository find by username detail, get username is present, return the response entity, per request, body username already exists. So it's going to check the database if the username already exists, and if it does, it will return a username already exists message over there. So this is where it will create and save a new user. So user equals a new user, set the username, set the password, and it's going to hash the password into the database, and then it's going to save the user, and it's going to return the basic user information like the ID and the username. And then this is how we're going to authenticate the new user by letting the user log in. So it's going to when the user wants to log in, basically it's going to find the username. So user repository, find by username, detail, get username or else, return now. And then it's going to validate the username and the password. So if the user is now or the password encoder matches the detail get password, user get password, return the response for one invalid credentials. And then yeah, it's going to generate a JWT token for authenticated users. And then lastly, it's going to return a 200 response, okay, auth response DTO token. That is it for the auth controller. That's how long it is. Okay, so here we have the event controller. So here we have the annotation for trace controller, which will mark the class as a trace controller. The annotation for request mapping, which is the base URL for events endpoints. So here we have public event controller, event service. This event service is just going to inject event service. And then here we have get mapping, get all events, public response entity list events CTL, which will return the response entity okay with all the events. Next, we have the get mapping ID, which here we have public response entity event detail get by ID long ID return the response entity with the ID, so this will just get a single event by its ID. Here we have post mapping to create an event, so public response entity event detail create event request body create event request return response entity okay and create event request. So that will just create a new event. Then over here we have put mapping update existing events. So this will just basically update the existing event. So with public response entity event DTO update event with a long ID, and then it's going to update the event request, and then it's going to return the updated event ID in the request. And then lastly, this is how it deletes a event by the unique ID. So response entity void delete event path variable long ID, event service delete event by the ID and return the response entity with no content, which will be a true or false, so it's just going to delete an event by its unique ID. And then here we have the controller. So an annotation REST controller, which will mark the class as a REST controller. And then over here we have our get mapping. So like this. So it's going to handle the request to the root URL. And then over here we have public string home return welcome to event AI. This is just a welcome endpoint. I am done with the controllers, moving on to the DTO. So, okay, here we have the annotation data, which will generate the get as a set as equal hash code into strings. And here we have the private string email. So this is just the user's email address, and then private string password, which is the user password that was used before the hashing. Here we have another annotation, which is for data. So it's just going to generate the get as a set as the equals the hash code into strings, and then a annotation called all args constructor generates a constructor with all the fields, and then lastly we have private string token, which is the JWT token return after a successful login. Here we have the create event request. So public class create event request. So here we have private string title, which is the event title, private string description, which is the event description, private local date, time, date. So this is just the date and time of the event. And then up here we have an ID. Sorry, so here we have the private long organizer ID, which is the ID of the event organizer. Here we have private long user ID, which is the ID of the user creating an event. Here we have public string get title, return title, which will get an event title. Here we have public void set title, that's the title, that's what I set an event title. Here we have public string get description, return description, which will just get an event description. Here we have public void set description. That's what just set the event description. And then over here we have public local time get date. So that's what just get the event date and time. And then over here we have set event date and time, which will just set the date and the time of an event. Here we have public long organizer ID, return organizer ID. That's what just get the organizer ID. Here we have set organizer ID, which will just set the organizer ID. And then over here we have public long get user ID, return user ID, which will just get the user's ID. And then here we have public void set user ID, long user ID, thus user ID, which will just set the user ID. Next we have the event DTO. So here we have private long ID, which is the event's ID. Here we have private string title, which is the event's title. Here we have private string description, which is the event's description. Here it has private local date and time, which is the date and time of the event. Here is the private long created by user ID, which is the ID of the user who created the event. Here we have private long organizer ID, which is the ID of the event organizer. Here we have public event details. So as you can see, this is just a constructor. And then over here we have another one. So I'll highlight it like this. So the event detail has the long ID, it has a title, it has a description, it has the date and time created by the user and its ID and the organizer ID. So here we have I get method, so public long get ID, return ID, this will just get the event ID. Next we have public void set ID. This will just set the event ID. Here we have get title, return title, this will just get the event title. Yeah, it says public void set title, string title, thus title. So it's just going to set the event title. Here we have public string get description, return description. This will just get the event description. And then over here it says public void set description, string description. So this will just set the event description. Over here it says get event public local time get date return date. So this will just get the event date and time. Here it says public void set date local date time. This will just set the event date and time. Over here it says public long get created by user ID return create user ID. So this will just get the ID of the user who created the event. And then here it says public void set created by user ID, thus created by user ID, which sets the ID of the user who created the event. And then here it says public long get organizer ID return the organizer ID, which will just get the organizer ID. And then lastly, here we have public void set organizer ID. This organizer ID is just going to set the organizer ID. Here we have the login request DTL. So here we have private string username, which will just accept the user's name, and as well as the private string password, which will accept the user's password. Same thing here for the registration. So it's going to take the user's username as well as a password. So here we have the update event request. So private string title, which is the event title, private string description, which is the event description, private local date time, which is the event date and time, private long organizer ID, which is the ID of the event organizer, and then private long user ID, which is the ID of the user updating the event, and then public string get title, return title, those will just get the event title. Here we have public void set title, so this will just set the event title. Yeah, it says public string get description, return description, so this will just get the description of an event. Here we have public void set description. This description, so this is just going to set the event description. And then over here it says public local date get date, return the date, so it's just going to get the date of the event. And then here it says public void set date local date time. So this is just going to set the event date. And then over here it is public long get organizer ID, which will just, and then also return organizer ID, which will just get the organizer's ID. Here it says public void set organizer ID, that's organizer ID. So this is just going to set the organizer's ID. And then here it says public long get user ID, return the user ID. So that's what just get the user's ID. And then lastly it says public void set user ID, this user ID, so this is just going to set the user ID. And then here we have the file user DTO. So it's going to store the user's ID and the user's username. That is it for the DTO folder. Moving on, we have our model. So let me just see how long is the video. So yeah, we have the event class. So here we have the annotation for entity, which will just mark the class as a JP8 entity in the database. And then we have the annotation table, which will just map all the events to the table. Okay, so here we have the annotation generated value, which is the auto increment ID. And then over here we have private string title, which is the event title, and here we have private string description, which is the event description. And then private local date and time, which is the event date and time. And then we have many to one, which is the many events that can belong to one organizer. And then join column name organizer user ID, which is the foreign key column. And then we have many to one, which is the many events that can be created by one user. And a join column user ID, which is the foreign key column. Moving in, we have our getters and setters. So here we have public long get ID, return ID. So those will just get the ID of the event. And then over here, we have public void set ID, this ID, which will just set the ID of an event. And then here we have public string get title, return title. This will just get the title of an event. And then over here we have public void set title of this title. So this will just set the title of an event. And then over here we have public string get description, return description, which will just um get a description of an event. And then we have public void set description string description. This will just set a description of an event. And then over here we have public local time get date, return date will just get the date of a event. And then we have public void set date, local date time plus date which will just set a date of the event. Then over here we have public organizer get organizer, return the organizer to just get the event organizer. And then also we have public set organizer, thus organizer which will just set the organizer of the event. And then over here we have public user get user return the user, so let's just get the user of the event. And then we have public set user, this user that equals to that user, which will just set the user of the event. And then over here we have entity which will just mark class as a JPA entity in the database. And then we have table organizers, which are just mapped to organizers table. And then we have generated value strategy generation type identity, which is the auto increment ID. Here we have private string name, which is the organizer name. Here we have private string email, which is the organizer's email. So here we have the annotation one to many mapped by the organizer, which is the organizer's field in the events entity. And then we have cascade type all. This is just the processor remove the events automatically. And then we have orphan removal true, which will remove the events if it is removed from the list. And then we have private list events, which are just lists of the events organized by the organizer. Moving on, we have our getters and setters. So here we have public long get ID. So this will just get the ID of the organizer. And then we have public set ID, which will just set the ID of the organizer. Next, we have public string get name, return name, which will get the name of the organizer. And then we have set name, public void set name, this name, which will just set the name of the organizer. Here we have public string get email, return the email, so this will just return the, so this will just get the email of the organizer. And then we have public void set email, plus email, which will just set the email of the organizer. And then we have public list get events, return events, so this will just get the events of the organizer. And then we have public void set events, so this will just set the events of the organizer. Here we have the annotation entity, which will just mark the class as a JP entity in the database table. And then we have table, which will just map, table name users, which will just map the users table. And then over here we have the generated value strategy generation type identity, which will auto implement the ID. So here we have private string username, which is the username for the login, and then private string password, which is the hash password. Then we have one-to-many, map by user, which is the user field in the event entity, cascade type, cascade equal to cascade type all, which will persist to remove the events automatically, and then orphan removal, which is true, which will remove the events from the list. Private list events, which just lists the events created by this user. So here we have public long get ID, return ID, which will just get the ID of the user, and then we have public void set ID, which will set the ID of the user. Then we have public string get username, which will just get the username of the user, and then we have public void set username, which will set the user name. Next, we have get password, return password, so this will just get the password of the user. And then we have set password, public void set password, so this way it will set the password of the user. And then over here we have public test event, get events, return events, so this will just get the events of the user, and then public void set events, this event this will just set the events of the user. That is it for the model. Moving on, we have the security. So here we have the annotation service. This will just mark the class as a Spring Service component. And then over here, we have public customer detail service, user repository, and this user repository. This will just inject the user repository. And then over here we have an override method. So public user details, load user by username, string username, or throw an exception if it's not found. And then here we have user repository, find by username. So this will just find the user by the username, and if it's not found, it's going to throw an exception in a message say this is user not found. And then here we have the return Spring Security user details. So user dot get username, which is the username, user get password, which is the hash password, and new array list, which is the authorities or the roles. Here we have the annotation for the component which marks this class as a Spring component bean. And then over here we have public JWT auth filter. And here we have the JWT util. So this JWT util equal to the JWT util. So this is where we just and also the user detail service and equals to the user detail service. So this is where we inject the JWT in the user detail service. So here we have the get authorization header. So string auth header request get header authorization. So give me a second. Okay. So yeah, we have the string auth header request get header. So this will just retrieve the value of the authorization header from the incoming HTTP request. So this header is typically contains the barrier token used for the authentication. And then over here we have string token equal to null. So it's just initialize a variable to hold the extracted token that will be passed from the header. And then here we have string username now. So it initialize a variable to hold the username. And then over here we have an if statement, an if block, and a try block, and a catch block. So if the auth header is now and the auth header starts with the bearer, the token auth header substring will index at 7. So it's going to check if the header starts with a bearer and it's also going to extract the token. And then in the try block, it says the username JWT util extract username token, which will just extract the username from the token. And if it does go wrong, we get an exception that will say an invalid JWT token. Here we have our if statement. So if username is now and security context holder, so get context and get authentication is now the user details, user detail, and the user detail service load user by username, which is the username. So if the username exists and authentication is set yet. Next we have another if statement. So if JWT dot validate token user detail get username. So this is just going to validate the JWT token against the provided username. And this also ensures that the token is authenticated and matches the expected use. Next we have username, password authentication token, auth token. New username, password authentication token, user details, credentials null, user details get authorities. So it's going to create an authentication object using the validated user details, and then it also has parameters. Principal user details for the authenticated user, credentials. Now, since it already has a valid token, no password is needed. And then authorities, which is the user detail to get authorities, the roles and permissions assigned to the user. And then over here we have security context holder get context set authenticator auth token. So this is just going to set the authentication object into the security context. This also makes the user considered logged in for the current request lifecycle. And then here we just have filter chain to filter request response. And as we'll just continue with the filter response. Next we have the JWT util. Here we have private final secret key secret key for signature algorithm. So this is just a secret key for signing into the JWTs. Here we have private final long expiration time 1000, 60, 60, and 10. So this is the token expiration time, which is 10 hours. Yeah, we have public string generate token. So this is just going to generate a JWT token for the given username. And then it's going to return the JWT folder, the set subject username when it was issued, which is the date, when it's going to expire, and then the signing key, and then a compact, which is the build token. Here we have public boolean validate token string and string username, string token username, extract username token, and then return token username equals to username and the token is expired. So this is just going to validate the token that matches the username and it is not expired. Here we have public string extract username, return JWT pass builder, set signing key, and then we have a build, and then we have pass claim JWS token, and then we have get body, and then get subject. And then over here we have private boolean is token expired string token, and then the return JWT pass builder, and it's also going to return the set signing key, the build pass flame JWS token, the get body, the expiration, and the date. So that is it for my security folder. And then lastly, I have the service folder. So here we have public event service, event repository, user repository, organizer repository. So this is a constructor injection of the repositories, which allows the service to access the events, the users, and the organizers in the database. Here we have public list event detail get all events, return the event repository find all.stream, map this detail, which will convert the event detail into the event detail, and then it's obviously going to collect to the list. So it's going to retrieve all the events from the database and convert them into details, and it's going to return a list of event details. Here we have public event detail get event by ID long ID, and then also event repository find by ID or else throw an exception, which is a runtime event not found, and then it's going to return the DTR event. So it's going to retrieve a single event by its ID, and then it's going to return the event DTR, and if it fails, it's going to throw an exception. The event is not found. Over here we have public event DTO create event, and then we have event, which is a new event, and then event set title, get title, set description, get description, and event set date, get date. So let's just create a new event and save it to the database. And then it's going to request the create event request from DTO with the event data, and then it's going to return the created event DTO. Next, we have a if statement over here. So if request get organizer is now organizer event, and the organizer repository find by ID request to the get organizer ID or else throw an exception. So it's just going to link the events to the organizer if the organizer ID is provided. Here we have another if statement. So if the request get user ID is now user repository find by ID request get user ID will throw an exception. So it's going to link the event to the user if the user ID is provided. And then we have event repository save event, return the event details. So this is just going to save the event to the database. Here we have public event detail, update event, long ID, update request, event repository find by ID, and we have an exception. So it's going to update an existing event by its ID. Uh, And then we have the request update event DTO with the updated data, and it will return the updated event. Here we have another statement. So request get organizer ID null. Organizer repository find by ID, get organizer ID, or throw an exception. So this is just going to update the organizer if it is provided. And then here we have if request get user ID equals to null, so user repository find by ID, get the user ID, or throw an exception, it will update the user if it is provided. And then here we have event repository save, turn to TTL, it will process the changes. And then over here we have public void delete event long ID, event repository find by ID or throw an exception. So it's going to delete an ID from the database by the unique ID. And then it's going to throw an exception if the event is not found. Okay. Here we have private event DTL to DTL event. So here it's going to create a new event and it's going to set the ID of the event, and then it's going to set the title of the event, it's going to set the description of the event, it's going to set the date and time of the event, and it's going to set the created by user ID and as well as the organizer ID, and it will return the event. And that is it for my code.